Sunday morning at the California Speedway in Fontana. Every weekend at strips like this around the country, owners come to push their highly modified street cars to the limit over a quarter mile. This is drag racing at its roots. While pro racing is for the select few, there are tens of thousands of amateur draggers who devote most of their spare time and money to the pursuit of speed. America has had a long love affair with hot rodding, and lately it's become a booming sport, with new drag strips opening across the country. On this day, 500 drivers have each paid $20 to make a guaranteed 4 runs. Any car that's street legal and can pass the safety inspections can run. No 2 cars are alike. Each one has been customized inside and out to give it an edge.
This is a 78 Pontiac Trans Am.
Rudy Lopez has spent $25,000 on it so far.
I took the engine out, I put this one in there. It's a 455, the biggest motor Pontiac offered. I played with it, put some headers, put in exhaust, intake. When you do horsepower, then you got to upgrade everything else. So I redid the suspension, lower, beefier springs, gas shocks, tires. Basically, I made it into a road racer.
Dilwyn Brando has reworked his 66 GTO to run at 500 horsepower, about 50% more than the factory version.
The heads that are on here, I've had a little bit of port work done. We put an Edelbrock Performer RPM manifold on. I've got a Demon 850 carburetor under this air cleaner. We put the K&N air filter on here, and with that new top so that it gets more air into the engine.
The changes made his GTO one of the fastest cars at this meet, running the quarter mile in 11.4 seconds from a standing start, hitting 123 miles per hour by the finish line. Amateur drag racers are now spending more than $1 billion a year on performance parts. And increasingly, the cars of choice are not the traditional American muscle cars, but smaller, cheaper Japanese imports the racers call rice rockets.
Well, this is a 1995 Honda Accord LX. Got transformed from original engine, single cam 2.2 to a Prelude engine 2.2. So the horsepower is from 165 stock to 220 horsepower. I got the headers done. I got the intake done. When I got this car with the stock engine that I had, when I ran it here, I hit a 16.5. With this engine, it held me about 2 seconds of hitting a 14.4.
Japanese cars are cheap to buy secondhand. Performance upgrades are easy to find, and they allow room for creativity.
Why a Japanese car? Well, it's a lot funner to fix up a Japanese car because the muscle car already has the power. You can buy it off the lot and it'll be really fast. But this one, it makes it a lot more funner, but it takes a whole lot to make it go as fast as a V8.
My name is Nalani, and I actually own this 1990 Honda CRX White. I've been racing for about a year and a half, maybe 2, somewhere in there. A couple modifications to the car, DC headers, Type R intake manifold, AM intake, just a stock motor, but runs pretty well. 14.4s in the quarter mile. It's a male-dominant world out here, so it's a little intimidating, but once you get behind the wheel, it's all you, it's all about you. I just like it because I'm behind the wheel, I'm in charge of what's going on with the car, and it just gives you an adrenaline rush when you go through the gears and stuff.
The growth in organized drag racing is a response to a recent rise in illegal street racing. Police across the country have been waging campaigns against a trend so strong that it spawned the #1 movie in 2001, The Fast and the Furious.
Well, the top speed that I ran so far on the freeway would be 140. That's what I went so far. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that on TV, but too late now.
No one's pretending that legal drag meets have eradicated street racing, but officials say they are making a difference.
You know, you talk to some of the kids that when you walk through the pits, if they weren't here, they'd be out doing it on the street. I mean, people have a fascination with their cars. They love speed. We just like to get them in a controlled racing environment.
I tried to race it just here because it's getting too dangerous out there. Too many police, too many people. It's just getting too reckless.
The pull between legal and illegal drag racing is nothing new. It's a story nearly as old as the American automobile. Coming up, the birth of the hot rod and how these modified factory cars morphed into dragsters. When you look at the frightening power of a modern pro dragster, it's hard to believe that it's a direct descendant of the Model T Ford, but it is. No sooner did Henry Ford begin rolling out Model Ts from the assembly line in 1914 than young drivers began modifying them to see how fast they could go. Like today's import racers, the Model Ts were relatively cheap, and spare parts were plentiful. From the 1920s on, street racers stripped their cars down to cut wind resistance. Then they added specialty parts like 16 valve heads and tubular exhaust headers that helped to double or triple the Model T's modest 20 horsepower engine. The cars were known as hot roadsters, hot rods for short. In the 20s and 30s, owners raced their hot rods on the dry lakes north of Los Angeles and hit speeds of 120 miles an hour. Don Montgomery has spent a lifetime racing and writing about the early hot rods and dragsters.
This is an excellent example of a 1930s hot rod. It was actually built in 1939. It has a T-body, the intake manifold, an Edelbrock manifold for 3 carburetors. The maxi heads utilize the regular intakes but move the exhaust up into the head. This car was clocked at 120.
Hot rod drivers also raced on public streets and became the target of newspapers and newsreels that called them dangerous, wild young men. Drag racers challenged each other to short sprints. A quarter mile became the accepted distance. Amid official complaints, drag racing went legitimate. In 1949, at Goleta Airport in California, hot rod drivers held races with police approval. Soon, there were weekly drag races at Santa Ana, California. And within 2 years, there were 130 sanctioned drag strips around the country. Many of them were supervised by the newly formed National Hot Rod Association, which still runs drag racing today. At first, the drivers raced the same cars they'd been using on the street or at the dry lakes, modified roadsters that doubled as their everyday transport. Future Hall of Fame drag racer Tommy Ivo began his career with this altered Model A.
It was my very first hot rod. I built it when I was 19 years old. Picked up a body that we found out there, put it on a Model A frame, and took a Buick engine and put it in, a Buick V8. And then, of course, the headers that come out the side, the big wings there. The less restriction you have, the better it is. We don't want it running through mufflers and everything, so we have a little cap that we take off the end that would let it just run out the back. And of course it'd make an enormous amount of noise, and of course the more noise you make, the better it is. This particular car right here, the best it run 119 miles an hour in a quarter mile. And I'm telling you, we thought we were just ripping the asphalt off the ground to do that.
Drivers soon began sacrificing looks for performance. To improve the acceleration they needed to win drag races, they stripped their cars mercilessly. This 1950 example, called the Bug, reached 103 miles an hour over the quarter mile.
It took the racers probably 10 minutes to realize that the lighter car was the winner. So this is an example of what was built. This car was actually put together with a roadster body and everything not needed thrown away. There's no radiator on it. The only important thing in the whole car, as far as most of the racers are concerned, was the engine. The rest of it was just something to get them there. This car is what leads into the dragsters of the future.
Dragster design changed quickly in the 50s, a time of intense experimentation. Cars became narrower and lighter, with longer wheelbases aimed at shifting the weight to the rear tires for traction. Legendary driver Art Chrisman was the first man to hit 140 miles an hour at the drag strip. He ran 9.4 seconds for the quarter in this modified roadster that he still keeps in tune today.
When I got it, like I say, it was a very short wheelbase car, and it didn't handle very good. You know, it was pretty squirrely. So we made it longer and set the driver further back, and it straightened it right out.
Art Chrisman next, 145 miles an hour, the fastest single-engine time of the meet.
Art boosted the power of his Ford V8 by running 4 carburetors for better fuel supply. But speeds were limited by the tires. 50's technology could not make them big enough to give the needed traction.
We run 140 miles an hour with tires that are 5 inches wide, you know. And now they're, 3 times that wide.
In their search for speed, 50's drag racers experimented with a rocket fuel called nitromethane, a fuel so effective it's still used today. Nitromethane needs only 1/10 as much oxygen as gasoline does to ignite. So race cars can use much more of it and create more power.
We run nitromethane, which back in those days we run straight nitro to get all the power you could, The more fuel you put in it, the faster it ran until it didn't like it anymore, and then it blew the crank out.
Using nitro, dragsters hit unthought of speeds around 170 miles an hour. Officials thought that was too fast to be safe. So in 1957, the National Hot Rod Association banned nitro. Dragsters would have to use pump gasoline. Drivers looked for new power sources, like multiple engines. Tommy Ivo built this twin-engine dragster in 1959 and became the first man to run the quarter in less than 9 seconds on gasoline.
Good grief. I ran 180 miles an hour in this thing. I guess it proves when you're younger, you're fearless, huh? Now this was really unusual. As you can see, the engines are tilted. There's only one drive shaft in the car, so we transferred the horsepower from that motor to that motor through the ring gears and then used one clutch to run it out the back. So we had to rig this motor up so it ran backwards and the other one ran forward like it was supposed to, so it could mesh the ring gears together.
2 engines worked so well that in 1960, Tommy Ivo decided to try 4 of them. But the extra weight made the car a little too heavy to run records. Also, because the car was 4-wheel drive, it needed heavy racing tires on both back and front. That meant extra traction and extra smoke.
You'd step on the gas, the front tires would start smoking and come rolling back across the car. And it was odd because, just for about 50, 100 feet, you couldn't see quite where you was going. So there was a lot of looking till the wind would probably carry the smoke away so that you could see where you were going.
The late 50s and early 60s was drag racing's golden age of experimentation. But it often came at a terrible price. Drag racing designers in the late 50s and early 60s tried almost everything. Multiple engines, rocket fuel, even aircraft engines, although they proved too heavy. There was also the question of where to put the driver. The favorite place was over the rear axle to get weight onto the back tires. This design was called the slingshot.
The main thing is getting the traction, and you didn't have the traction until you started sitting behind the rear end. You sit behind the rear end, sit lower, you got a lot more traction.
Then Tommy Ivo makes a spectacular run, looking very much like a rocket shot out the Cape. Time 185 miles an hour.
You just kind of got used to the slingshot idea of having your legs draped across the rear end here. You'd have the throttle, of course, that you would push to open. You'd have the clutch to work. Of course, the parachute, you'd push that out first, and then your hand would just move over to the brake and pull it on down. Because things happen so fast when you're running 180 miles an hour and you got a quarter of a mile to stop that you didn't make any wasted motions.
The slingshot experiment proved dangerous. With the driver sitting directly behind the increasingly volatile engine, it meant engines could, and did, blow up literally in the driver's face. Also, experiments with lighter bodies and greater horsepower caused many cars to flip out, and dozens of drivers were killed.
I think there was a lot of cars out there that were way too light. There's a lot of guys that built lightweight cars that aren't around anymore. And I always had a heavy car, and I never did crash one.
After nitromethane was allowed again in 1963, the shape of the modern dragster started to become standardized. Drivers needed only one engine on nitro, so dragsters became leaner and lighter. Most were still slingshots. With that combination in 1964, Don Garlits became the first man to officially clock 200 miles per hour.
Big Daddy Don Garlits.
In this car.
This car here was powered by a supercharged Chrysler engine. It developed at that time approximately 1,500 horsepower. By today's standards, very simple technology. This is the same basic engine you would have probably had in your passenger car. If you had had a Chrysler Imperial, it's a Chrysler V8, 392 cubic inches as produced from the factory. And at this time, they used most of the basic components of the original Chrysler engine. The big change was the addition of the supercharger in place of the carburetors that would have been on a stock car.
But just as the dragster was being refined, a whole new kind of drag car was emerging. In the mid-60s, designers began taking Detroit stock cars and moving the wheels forward about a foot to push weight to the back.
They inched the rear wheels forward a few inches, and then the front wheels forward a few inches. Pretty soon someone looked at them and says, that really looks funny, and the name Funny Car came about.
car is the little 62 Chevy 2, which was basically an economy car. Initially, they came with 4 cylinders and 6 cylinders, and the back wheel was originally back in this area, and shoved it forward, took the front wheels, just like you see here, which were originally back in this area, shoved it forward, which gave the weight transfer. You've got all the traction on the back. And as you see, it's no longer capable of keeping the engine under the hood. You have the Hilborn injector stacks on a big block Chevrolet, and what had been an economy car was now capable of running the quarter mile at over 150 miles an hour in just a little more than 9 seconds.
Funny cars were a huge hit with fans because they looked like their own street cars. But under the hood, funny cars had enough power to challenge the fastest dragsters.
This is a 1971 Dodge Challenger. When it's up, you see a sophisticated race car. They have the fuel tank up in the nose. The nitromethane alcohol mixture goes into the fuel pump, then up to the fuel injector hat at the top of the supercharger. And this is all mounted on an iron block 426 Chrysler. This car was capable of probably 215 to 220 miles an hour in the quarter, which is obviously a great progression from the little Chevy 2 that was barely over 150 miles an hour.
Although racing in separate classes, funny cars began clocking times nearly as fast as open dragsters. The dragster design is lighter and it gets off the line quicker. But the funny car's aerodynamic shell and extra downforce almost make up the difference. Open dragster remained king of the track, and advances in horsepower, tires, and body design pushed speeds ever higher. They broke the 250-mile-per-hour barrier in 1975, covering the quarter mile in 5.5 seconds. The 300 barrier fell in 1992.
What we have here is the first drag racing vehicle to exceed 300 miles an hour in the quarter mile. Virtually everything in the car has just been stepped up a notch. This supercharger right here is much larger. This is basically what they call a 1471 supercharger. 2 huge magnetos to keep this fuel mixture lit. Everything has just gotten bigger and stronger, and it's just a game of more.
Today, dragsters can hit 330 miles per hour, eating up the quarter mile in 4.5 seconds. Wheelbases have stretched to 300 inches. Giant rear wings have added downforce, and engines have been moved behind the driver, improving traction and safety. Funny cars have kept pace along the way, using similar engine advances, plus aerodynamic improvements to consistently run above 320 miles an hour. Coming up next, one of today's top drivers takes us step by step through the technology that makes up a state-of-the-art dragster. The job of a drag race driver is straightforward. To go from 0 to more than 300 miles an hour in just over 4 seconds. It's a dangerous task that's claimed scores of racers over the years.
You better be paid up and prayed up. You're just really on the edge. All your attention and all your energy is focused on the starting line. If you're late on the starting line, you'll lose every time.
Gary Clapshaw is one of the top drivers in America today. He has to pilot a machine that mounts an engine as powerful as a freight train on top of a thin web of metal alloy tubing.
You have to find the strength from within to match the strength of the car. Otherwise, the car will overpower you, and you'll end up either not making it down the track or worse.
Clapshaw's success, and indeed his very life, depend on a crew of experts who test, tune, strip, and rebuild his car after every single run. Clapshot took us inside his Las Vegas workshop for a detailed look at a state-of-the-art, top-fuel dragster, beginning with the tremendous engine.
The average automobile may have 350 horsepower. These have 7,000. But the design of the motor is an American V8, just like what has been built and put in regular cars for the last 30, 40 years. But this is an aftermarket design. It's all aluminum. There's only one or two engine makers, motor builders that produce these blocks.
Helping to drive the engine are an injector and a supercharger. Together, they force massive amounts of air into the engine, mixing with the fuel to create a stronger combustion.
This is the injector. The supercharger sits right underneath it. As the air goes through the injector, and then it's compressed with the supercharger. And that's how she breathes, and that's what makes the fire.
One reason dragsters generate such awesome power is their fuel, nitromethane. It's burning nitro that you see coming out of the exhaust system. Once banned as too powerful, nitro is still restricted. Race fuel can be no more than 90% nitro, so it's mixed with less powerful alcohol.
They had some serious explosions a few years ago on 100%, so they cut it back to try and limit blower explosions.
Dragsters burn an incredible amount of fuel at the rate of over 150 gallons a minute. The 32 fuel injection nozzles would empty a streetcar's gas tank in about 10 seconds.
These are the fuel pump levers. You have two pumps on the car. One is the low side, the other is the high side. And just before you leave, you turn both pumps on. You start the car with one and do your burnout with one pump. And as you pull up into the lights, you put the other one on.
This model of a single cylinder shows the huge fuel appetite. This is how much fuel one cylinder uses when idling. But look at what happens when the race driver floors the pedal.
The motors are extreme, and on nitromethane, there's nothing else that compares to them. As a driver, if you're not careful, you can go out and you can explode these motors one right after another.
And here are the fragments of what was once a motor before nitromethane exploded inside the engine block.
It split the engine. I've just got a small chunk of the engine here. You can see where the head gasket's there. This is the rear section of the block. There would be two more cylinders up here and two more cylinders over here. So this is a third of the engine, I guess. This here is the supercharger. It split the side off. Everything that there was to break, it broke. It would be approaching $50,000.
To try to avoid such catastrophes, the crew checks the car after every run. On race days, they have to be able to strip and reassemble it in about an hour. One part that gets special attention is the clutch assembly, which channels the engine's horsepower to the tires. The clutch's interlocking plates are put under such pressure that they last for only 1 or 2 runs.
They just disintegrate, basically. They disintegrate and they get so hot, and the plates in between, it all welds together and sticks together. So these plates in between are replaced every time. This is a good comparison between a brand new and used pitted glazed over disc. Tears them up.
So this is the computer power system that all the information is gathered into and then is stored in here. And at the end of the run, we open this up and we put the chip on it and we draw everything out of the system, and we can take it into the trailer and put it on the computer screen, and it'll tell us exactly what took place.
To handle the enormous horsepower, dragsters need huge tires for traction. Each of the rear tires, called slicks, is 17 inches wide.
These tires are smooth, as you can see, and in normal conditions, these would have no traction on a regular street application. However, when you go to the racetrack and the track has been prepared and it is very sticky on the surface, and when you have a very sticky surface on the track, that allows for complete surface coverage of the tire on the track, and it's like a bonding of an adhesive.
High above the rear tires, modern dragsters have a wing. It's not there for lift, quite the opposite.
The rear wing is designed to create downforce on the back tires. So as you start down the track and as you gain mile an hour, the pressure increases to a point to where you have over 5,000 pounds of downforce on the rear tires. If you didn't have this, the tires would spin with this much horsepower. You could never get them hooked up.
And when those tires hook up, the metal tubing chassis of a modern dragster bends under extreme stress.
Under acceleration, the chassis is made to flex. And through here, it will bow up at least 4 to 6 inches, right in this area. And the front wing keeps the front end down, the rear wing keeps the tires hooked, and what it does is it causes the chassis to arc up into a semicircle, and it will actually go down the track like this when it's under pressure. And when you let off the throttle, then it'll flatten back out. A lot of runs, people say, oh, it looked like it was nice, clean, smooth, straight lap, but in the car, it's quite a bit different than that. You're moving the wheel because they certainly don't want to go straight, and they're accelerating so fast that the back end's actually wanting to drive around the front of the car.
When a vehicle crosses the finish line at over 300 miles per hour, it needs some help to stop. That's when the driver hits the parachutes, an item that's been standard since the 50s.
This is the brake in the car, and it's controlled by hand. So when you're in the car, you're actually driving with the one hand and you're running the brake with the other. And then these are the parachute levers to deploy the parachutes. I prefer as a driver to pack them myself. If there's a problem, I know who to blame. We're doing over 300 when we deploy them, so everything's got to be right, or we'll be off the end of the track and lose the car.
The power of a dragster makes even its crew nervous. Although they know the car better than anyone, none of them wants to swap places with Gary.
I wouldn't get in this thing to drive it for anything.
I wouldn't either.
So, you know, it's a favorite saying around camp is we wouldn't get out of the electric chair to drive it, you know. So.
And it's that concern about safety that might limit dragsters from going much faster. Officials, citing safety concerns, have put restrictions on tires, fuel, engine size, gear ratios, and many other technologies.
We're being confined to a certain playing field, so we're down to finding hundredths of a second or thousandths of a second to increase our performance.
So what does the future hold? Coming up, a leading designer unveils his latest machine that could take drag racing in a new direction. There are millions of four-cylinder cars in the world, but so far, none like this. A standard street car with 4 cylinders has less than 200 horsepower. This still experimental dragster has 4,000. It's built to go 250 miles an hour plus, and it's a glimpse into one future direction of dragster design. Its designer, Bob Norwood, says there's not much room left for innovation with today's top dragsters. He says the big V8 dragsters can't be improved much more because of safety rules. So he's taken the power technology of the dragster and combined it with the size and the look of today's most popular street racers, the Japanese four-cylinder cars. The result is a car he calls the Max 4.
With that mindset, we came into this thing, let's just go out, start off with a small motor, which is a four-cylinder versus a V8, and it's going to have inherently less power because it's smaller, but we can put more technology back in it and get it to where it matches something like a car that you could buy today.
On the outside, the Max 4 looks pretty similar to the street car it was modeled after.
We started with the Honda Acura Integra body, and that's where our changes began. We started changing everything. We went 20 inches narrower. We added a 14-inch distance here to get the wheelbase out from 100 inches to 115. We made all Lexan windows and stuff for it and blocked off the doors so you don't see the door handles or any of the doors or anything. This is where the exhaust comes out. These air vents that flip up under high pressure to let the air out. 2 parachutes. When we got all done, this is the only part that was the original part, and that's the decal on the back.
But underneath, the Max 4 is anything but a street car. It's an updated version of Pro Dragster technology.
Basically, this is the whole fuel system in this part of the deal. The cam belts and cam drives and the cam towers, spark plugs, 3 for each cylinder. These are the turbochargers. Exhaust manifolds. This box is a steering box. It's always in gear. It has only 1 gear. There's no transmission. The brakes are run by hand. This is the brake. Solid, smooth rubber tires, 17 inches wide, and a rear end final drive here, which is a 3.2 gear ratio that runs a big titanium axle shaft that drives the wheels.
There are already classes of four-cylinder cars on the Pro circuit. They hit top speeds of around 190 over the quarter mile. Norwood projects that his car will eventually go 250 and cover the distance in less than 6 seconds. One reason is the huge engine block that dwarfs other four-cylinder blocks. It has a capacity of 286 cubic inches, or 4.8 liters, and is cut from a solid chunk of aluminum.
This engine is not liquid cooled at all. It has no oil drains going back through, all the oil drains on the outside, and so it's solid, it's that thick. And it's just, that piece of aluminum that thick has got a lot of strength, and that's what we need, is a good, strong case to hold all the parts, so it can take the huge horsepower, 4,000 horsepower.
Perhaps the biggest innovation is the fuel system. Like the top drag cars, the Max 4 runs on powerful nitromethane. But instead of pre-mixing the nitro with alcohol, this car has 2 separate fuel tanks. Onboard computers decide when to use each fuel.
This is the alcohol tank, and this tank contains the nitromethane. There's a small battery which runs the 2 computers. This computer on the top runs the ignition and the nitro, and the computer on the bottom runs the alcohol and does all the data logging.
Norwood says his system will cut the fuel costs in half and greatly reduce the risk of nitro explosions inside the engine.
We start the engine on alcohol, and then after, when we're ready to run, we're just ready to stage the car, we turn on the nitromethane. As we go down the track, we're going to roll out the nitro at about the 1,000-foot mark and run a bunch of alcohol to that last 300 feet. And it keeps the engine from getting killed in the process. Ignition on.
The hard part is finding exactly how and when to switch between fuels. 1/100th of a second could make all the difference.
And if I want to add some fuel, let's say right there, then what I do is I just go like this, because that's more fuel. This is less fuel. We do all our tuning with instead of a screwdriver or changing jets, we just do it with a computer right here. Now I've just richened that mixture up right there in that spot. It's just a learning curve, and it's a steep one.
Norwood says the Max 4, once he's finished tweaking it, will sell for around $100,000 for the whole car, and that running costs will be about a quarter of those of a top dragster.
Thought it'd give you a good pop.
Some of the Max Force technologies are currently not allowed in pro drag racing. For example, computer-driven fuel injection and boosting the turbochargers with nitrous oxide, a powerful gas once used in fighter aircraft. But Bob thinks the rules will eventually catch up with the technology.
So, you know, this is going to be a no rules type deal. It's not a class Ford. It's going to be a purely exhibition type car right at this point in the game. But it looks to me as something that is potentially going to happen, and if nothing else, I'll be the first guy that ever did this.
Drag racing has always been about trying new designs to challenge the rules of man and the laws of physics. History suggests racers will always find a better way to run the quarter mile, driven by the thrill of speed and the need to win.
It's just the challenge and the testing yourself, putting yourself out to the limits to see how good you are.
The sensation of the whole thing was so awesome, it's really hard to find words to describe the thing.